Hello, good morning. Welcome to part two of our conversation with Professor Amy Wax. So, part one ended on a rather hilarious note. We're talking about the importance of white men in America, and Amy agrees with me that white men are America's greatest asset. So, yes, Amy, white men, they're high in risk tolerance, they're individualistic, they're less likely to conform, and because many of these entrepreneurs are from the upper middle class, they have talent and ability. So I don't, as a libertarian, obviously there is a level playing field. But even when a level playing field exists, some groups will do better than others. That's just normal statistics.
Right. Well, let me just say that, praising white males is, just not a fashionable thing to do where I come from. So we should just get that on the table. Um, I think, obviously white males are a great engine of scientific innovation and entrepreneurial acumen and activity in our country, certainly have been. They bring good things to life, as they used to say in the General Electric ads. But right now they are highly disfavored. They are under a cloud. They are the demon in chief. They are the villains in chief.
Disfavored and disprivileged.
Disfavored and disprivileged. And you talked a moment ago about affirmative action, and how that is, uh, you predict, going to compromise our strengths as a nation and as a civilization and society. And that remains to be seen, but I think it's already happening in some ways. But that involves the displacement of the meritocracy and the people who would get ahead through the meritocracy. And until now, those people have disproportionately been white males. Now, the critics would argue that that's due to discrimination and systemic discrimination. It's all artificial. It's not earned privilege at all. Of course, I disagree with that. I think that that's wrong, and the evidence doesn't support it. But we also have to recognize that a lot of so-called white males, the native population, European population, and especially males, middle class and working class, are in trouble in a lot of ways.
Yes.
There are some very discouraging statistics out there about how these people are doing.
They're opting out of the labor force. Many of them are refusing to work.
Right. So,
They're demotivated.
the keystone of masculinity and sort of male responsibility, which is to function as the breadwinner, as the worker, that was not long ago a convention that was widely accepted, that men work. They're the providers, they're the supporters. That's been under attack from many quarters, and men have gotten the message. So,
Exactly.
as Nick
Men,
Eberstat, yes, has shown, we have a male workforce participation rate that is the lowest since the Depression.
Amy,
Yeah.
men propel economic growth. Companies built by men are more profitable than companies that are built by women, and they're also larger. And this is an empirical argument. Men are also more likely to start businesses, and they start businesses because they are motivated by economic rather than social goals. Men build societies. However, when men are degraded and demotivated, they become bombs. And women who are equally brilliant cannot be men. So no, it's highly unlikely that this generation of supposedly liberated women are going to create the next Amazon or the next Google. They will not. And I have actually argued that despite spending billions of dollars on programs to empower women in science and in entrepreneurship, we have gained little value. We're
Well, I'm very suspicious of these programs that push people into endeavors and into activities and positions that they don't spontaneously want to occupy. And certainly the push to get women into STEM or as founders of companies or into entrepreneurial positions has, that is an example of
It's
that.
unproductive. Women have a
Yeah,
different type of ambition than men. Men care more about money and status. Men
right.
men are bigger on risk. Their appetite for risk is just really huge.
Well, there's a lot of evidence for that. I have to concede. So,
And men are more abstract than women. They prefer computer science than women. We know what the data tell us. So spending millions to empower women in science, women who don't want to be scientists, that's a bad idea. If women want to be scientists, then help them, but don't force them to become scientists. That's wasting resources.
well, yeah, you're probably aware of the studies that David Lubinsky at
Yes, I am.
MIT has done, and they're very revealing because they control for intellectual ability. Now, you said before that on average men are smarter than women, and certainly the data supports that. I mean, try saying that in the academic setting, and you will be tarred and feathered. But
Well, no,
there's
I won't be tarred and fettered. I am black. I have black privilege. I can say what I want.
okay, well,
Yes.
that to some degree that's correct, but I don't know. That may change anytime soon. But yeah, so at the right tail of the curve, certainly because of the way that these distributions work, and you have to have statistics 101 to understand that, there are going to be more men at the very high end and at the very low end. But, what Lubinsky does is he says, well, let's just put that aside as a factor. Let's control for that. Let's just find women and men who are comparable in their cognitive ability and match them up and then follow them and see what careers they choose, what paths they choose, how they choose to balance work and life. And what he found is not surprising that even the smartest women prefer people to things. They tend to have stronger verbal skills and more balanced skills across verbal and math, so that influences it in part. But there also are preferences that are very important for people-oriented jobs and professions rather than thing-oriented jobs and professions. Men still tend to have more of the patents, higher status, more stellar and distinguished careers, more publications. They're more prolific in their output. Now, of course, what a feminist would say to that is, well, that's due to discrimination. That's due to the fact that we have a deeply sexist society and it puts up barriers to women achieving all of these things, and that explains everything. I think that's implausible. But it's very hard to refute that because we're talking about this intangible miasma, which is sexism that's out there, in the air. You can't really smell it or feel it or touch it, but we all have to believe it's out there, sort of like the way we have to believe that racism is out there, and nobody who cites structural racism really needs to get very specific. So these are items of faith. But I agree with you. When you match up men and women of roughly equal ability, they are going to have different life trajectories, and that's going to be a function significantly of the choices that they make.
And men are overconfident. So there's a new study in Frontier saying that men overestimate their intellectual abilities, but that's not anything new. That's not a new finding. Men are overconfident, and overconfident people are going to be motivated to achieve at a stratospheric level.
Right, and there are also, in addition to the studies that show that men are more confident in themselves, and who knows where that comes from? It probably comes from testosterone. They also are much less risk averse on average than women are, and there's a whole body
Yes.
of evidence for that. And being, that goes all the way back to evolutionary causes, right? Men get ahead by taking big risks. Women don't, and certainly in the reproductive sphere, and that probably translates over to other endeavors and areas. But risk, no big risk, no big gain.
Exactly. And the upside for women, Amy, is that Men are rewarded for being intelligent and successful. A woman does not need to create any value for her to get a man to marry her and have children. So there's an upside for women. Women have their beauty. Well, let me recant. A woman doesn't need to be particularly beautiful for a man to love her. Men will just love women because they have a vagina. That's just a reality. A lot of men think like that, even super smart men. You'd be amazed to observe how some of these intelligent men think. A woman has a vagina, so she's my wife. They like sex. Men like sex, and women have a body. So when we look at the trade-off, women do get some benefits.
Well, I'm not, there's nothing here that I can disagree with, but there have been some interesting developments recently that, cast doubt on the simplicity of this model, which, is valid as far as it goes. Women seem to be showing much less of an interest in getting married and having children these days. Now, whether that's driven by demand or supply is unclear, because as the availability and quality of the kind of men they would want to marry declines, then they're kind of forced by circumstance to turn their attention elsewhere. So we have many fewer people getting married, even among the elites. For now, the elites do tend to marry at very high rates, but it's unclear how long that will last. And also, it's estimated that about a quarter of women currently of childbearing age will end up with no children at all. It might be higher than that at the end of their reproductive life. Women are obviously looking elsewhere for life satisfaction. They're looking to the workplace and to status within the employment realm, within the financial realm, that's self-generated. Whether they'll actually be able to pull it off isn't clear. Now, what I think a critic would say is women have never been unhappier, and
Yes, they
we're
call
being
it the
enslaved.
paradox of female empowerment.
Right. So we've got measures that the more liberated and feminist and left a woman is, the more likely she is to have mental health problems, or at least be diagnosed with mental health conditions and be on psychotropic drugs. There's new data that's out that shows this very, very clearly, from various quarters. The future fate of women is an open question.
But there's a sex recession being driven by men. A lot of men are refusing to have sex. Some have posited that men don't want to sleep with parasitic and entitled women. I share that view somewhat, but on both sides, men and women seem to be withdrawing from emotional and sexual relationships.
Yeah, I think there's some evidence for that. Absolutely, there is, but that's a complicated phenomenon. I mean, part of it is, in my mind anyway, and this is just speculation because we have to just speculate about this stuff. There isn't really enough evidence for us to draw any firm conclusions. But a lot of it is a kind of switch to virtual life. It's a little bit like Huxley's Brave New World that we're living through right now, where instead of face-to-face encounters and friendships and interactions being a staple of everyday life, we spend a lot of time just interacting as you and I are interacting here through screens. And that isn't a very physical or immediate way to socialize. So there's a lot more atomization. I do not think that human beings thrive on that, and yet they gravitate towards it because it's the path of least resistance. When I was young, in the 50s, 60s, into the 70s, none of this stuff existed, and there just was a lot more socializing. I mean, for good or ill. And of course, socializing can be stressful, right? I mean, you have to learn those interactive skills if you're not very good at it. There can be a lot of disappointment and failure, or even heartache or heartbreak. People are popular, but some people are unpopular. You have to navigate all of the challenges and stresses of intensive social interaction. And when people have an avenue to escape that, even though I think that intensive social interaction is really good for them in the long run and makes them fully human and able to cope with all sorts of situations, if they have a route to escape that, they tend to take it, and that's what they're doing.
Well, it's great to socialize with quality people, but personally, I like my own space. I love to read books. So now, as we speak, there's a book beside me that I'm reading, and I want you to read it if you didn't read it before, because we're going to change the discussion a bit. Hey, Amy, I don't think you are a racist. That's actually a meaningless term. Sorry, not a verb. It's an adjective, but it's meaningless. You're not a racist, but you were called racist for saying that none of your black students graduated in what, the top 10% of your class, something to that effect.
Well, I said that what I basically said, and this is a paraphrase, is that blacks were not evenly distributed throughout the class in terms of grades, and that
Yes.
there was an undercount of blacks in the top of the class, the top half, the top quarter, that sort of thing. They weren't there proportional to their numbers. And, this has been I've been attacked for this. What hasn't happened is that the law school hasn't, of course, released any of the data that would show that I'm speaking falsely or that I'm wrong. I think the reason they won't release it is because it's quite likely that I'm right. But this is just the natural outgrowth of affirmative action. I mean, there's nothing new or surprising about this. It's been documented in other schools, in other settings. A guy named Richard Sander published
Yes.
a study out of California showing that blacks tend to cluster at the bottom of the class in his law school when they're admitted with lower LSATs, lower grades than the average student. I mean, this is what you would expect. It's not any big surprise. It's also not a slam dunk argument against affirmative action, in my
No.
opinion, because it's just one factor in the pros and cons of whether we should have any kind of racial preference. So I've never said otherwise. So I think the big fuss about my saying that is just a pretense to, get rid of one more conservative, to dump on someone who doesn't toe the line on a whole host of issues. The best way to do that is to start calling her a racist.
Well, Amy, I'm even going to be just a little bit more facetious and say that evidence is real. I like to be moved by the evidence. And for a long time, I deliberately avoided the studies on IQ, but I've read scores of them. And the conclusion is that IQ gaps are genetic. It's based on what I've been reading, it is no longer debatable.
Well, I wouldn't go that far. I would start by saying IQ gaps are real.
Yes, they are real.
And so let's just start there. And that's bad enough, because one of the items on the indictment of me, for behavioral violations is that I actually said that. Now, I said it, in a review of a book by Charles Murray that I was asked to review called Facing Reality, in which he marshals the evidence, which is overwhelming, that there is about a 15-point IQ gap between blacks and whites on average, and that has been consistently measured ever since measurement of this phenomenon started. It's about one standard deviation. The American Psychological Association has affirmed that that is a real finding. They affirmed it in 1975, again in 1996. They've never retracted that. So, we can start there. Now, you may think, what a bore. I mean, why would anybody ever doubt that that's the case? There's literally almost zero evidence that it's not true. But in the cloud cuckoo world of academia that we have today, the fairy tale fantasy land that is higher education today in America, people with a straight face will say, "Oh, she said that. that makes her a racist. That
Because they're
makes
so stupid.
well, I don't know whether it's stupidity or what it is, but that makes her unfit to teach at this university that she notices those facts. So now let's move on to what causes this undeniable phenomenon, right? And
Yes.
here are the options: nature or nurture, right? Or some combination thereof. Now, I have never opined definitively on this question, and there's a reason, which is, although I do, like you, follow the literature because I am curious, and I think it's a really important issue because it affects so many policies that we've adopted as a society, affects them quite profoundly, actually. Um, I am not a geneticist. I am not a human cognitive developmental psychologist. I'm not a biologist. I don't study biological anthropology, and I'm not an expert in this field. So I do not feel qualified
Yeah.
to make any kind of definitive statement here because it is a very complex field. It is a very kind of intricate and complicated set of questions, how you trace out the influence of innate traits versus external influences, right? And even people who do this for a living have struggle with it because there are tremendous puzzles. I'll give you an example and you'll know what I'm talking about because you do follow this. The influence of environment, when you're talking about children, the influence on children and the traits that they acquire, there's something called shared environment and non-shared environment. And what has been observed, for example, in looking at children in the same family or children who share genetic traits, right, is that the environmental piece is minimally shared environment and almost all non-shared environment. Well, nobody really knows what non-shared environment is, what the influences are and how to control or affect those influences. So our understanding of the nurture component that goes into the traits that people develop, and not just intelligence, okay? We're talking about personality traits like executive function, impulsivity, boldness, shyness, anything you can think of, they all appear, conscientiousness, they all appear to have, or could well have, based on the evidence, a genetic component. But the environmental component is a big mystery. So there are a lot of unknowns. That's all I'm really saying. I think if I had to give it my best guess, I would say that a lot of traits and attributes in human beings as they develop into adults have some mixture of components, of innate components, inherited genetic components, and environmental components. And it would be unusual, I would think, to have an important attribute that was totally environmentally determined. And certainly no one in the field that I know of thinks that any of them, except, really sort of a few traits that are kind of visible and obvious, are 100% innate. I mean, even things like skin color or physiognomy or height, they're none of those. Even those physical attributes are not 100% innate. They're
Stuart,
influenced by the environment.
Stuart Ritchie posits that education will increase IQ by about 6 points. The environment can increase intelligence, but these gains peter out during adulthood. This is what studies consistently show.
Well, I think it depends on the environment. I mean, one interesting insight is as the environment enriches and we all sort of get what we need from the environment to develop to our maximal potential, and I think, there are vast swaths of our society where that is true, then the importance of innate attributes come to the fore. In other words, the more we can control the environment, the more our innate capacities or potential becomes important. So, how much we are capable of improving cognitive ability or any trait for that matter by manipulating the environment depends on the baseline environment that we're working with.
Some people, Amy, have proposed modernization to discount the genetics of IQ by arguing that at one point the Japanese had a low IQ, Europeans had low IQs, but today IQs are higher because of better school and nutrition. Therefore, we can rule out genetic effects. But I disagree. My contention is the reverse. I am yet to see a study on the topic, and I don't know anybody who's brave enough to do such a study yet, but I think that modernization is actually revealing the genetic component of IQ. Because if better schooling and nutrition can increase intelligence, in other words, modernization pressure increases intelligence, then groups with greater genetic variance for IQ will record larger increases. So the
Right.
Japan,
Well, yes, that's a standard insight, I think, from
yes, so the Japan,
behavioral genetics
exactly. So
that I mean, the people who say that, the fact that we have richer environments and modernization and we spread all of those around, that means that environment becomes the most important thing. They don't, I think they're just 180 degrees wrong.
delusional, exactly. So like look at the example of Japan, for instance. The Japanese and other East Asians, they have recorded relatively massive gains in IQ because because these groups have genetic variants that are linked to what people call educational attainment.
Right. Well, I mean, if you just go to a more simple model like, animal size, I mean, animals who are in a poor environment, a stringent environment, they are going to be stunted in their size. They're not going to reach the full potential of their size. And then there's going to be a certain uniformity because everybody's stunted. But if the environment is enriched, then everybody's going to be able to reach their genetic potential. And the variation in genetic potential will be revealed.
Exactly.
There will be more of a splay in those attributes that you observe, the phenotype, so to speak, in a richer environment. So that's kind of, human genetics 101. And the people who don't understand that just don't know anything about the basics, frankly.
So Black Americans have recorded progress in America. This is indisputable. However, they have not fared as well under modernization pressure as other groups. And IQ is one factor, but we can also control for personality traits. So there's this writer called Anthony Walsh. I read him, and I also read Richard Lynn and other people. And studies consistently show that East Asians are more pro-social than whites, but whites are more pro-social than blacks. There are racial differences in time preference, in delayed gratification, in promiscuity, in our desire to form long-term relationships. Now, as we speak, I am reading Richard Lynn's book on racial differences in psychopathic traits, and he's sharing studies on group group differences in dishonesty and financial management, etc. So these are serious issues that I contend with on a daily basis. Have you ever read Richard Lynn?
I know who he is. I once tried to cite him for the proposition that men on average are more knowledgeable than women, and I was accused of citing a racist who couldn't possibly be right.
Richard
Uh,
Lynn is not a racist. Richard Lynn was basically one of the best psychology students in the 1950s. He's a world-class academic who writes today, even at 93 years of age.
but once that label attaches to him, it's kind of a tar baby, certainly in academia. The rules in academia are totally different, as you know. So, Richard Lynn and people like Steve Saylor, who's not a scientist, but he's a very good
Yes.
statistician and a very insightful guy. They're just personas non grata, and you can't rely on them. But I'm very familiar with Richard Lynn's work. I'm familiar with this data set. Of course, that the big question then is Why do those differences exist? Can we manipulate them? Are they environmentally malleable? Is this, this bugaboo, this bete noire of all pervasive structural or systemic racism, is that to blame? What are the components of that horrible force that is out there producing all of these differences? That's basically where the rubber meets the road.
There is systemic racism, but systemic racism is a term I employ to describe how government and private sector policies benefit minorities.
Well,
That's a systemic racism.
that is. But I think that's a good note for us to conclude on.
Yes,
Certainly,
yes.
there's a lot of
But
people who agree with you.
before I go, I wanted to share this study with you by Brian Pester. He was recently canceled, and Brian Pester and his co-authors are contending that the higher the level of complexity in the job, the less likely it is that blacks will be employed. And I am saying this against a backdrop of black male underemployment. I think that black males are more likely to be unemployed because of this IQ and academic issue. So some people will say black males were highly employed until the 1960s. In the 1960s,
Yeah.
there was deindustrialization, and I'm saying no. After the 1960s, the job market became more sophisticated. There was a stronger selection for IQ, and this could be a reason for the higher number of black men who are unemployed.
Well, I think I'm going to agree with you only in part.
It's
Um,
okay.
I do think that the job market did shift to put a tremendous premium on the ability to handle complexity, also known as high IQ, no question about it, and rewarded smart people to a greater degree. The smart premium has definitely gone up, no question about it. And that has, I think, hurt blacks because of this disparity. A number of people have taken note of this. I think it has generated the kind of hysterical anti-racism because these gaps now, if anything, have become more pronounced in their consequences and implications than they were in the past. But having said that, there still are places in our economy and our society for people who, have good values and are willing to work. There are jobs that don't require that much skill or intelligence that go begging. And what we're doing is, of course, we're bringing in people from other countries. We're sort of we're importing a coolie class to take jobs. We truly are. And, in my mind, it is, while black men stand idle on the street corner, we are, allowing these vast waves of immigration to come in and do a whole host of jobs that could be done, frankly, by our own native population, not just blacks, men, but whites and other groups that are average in their ability. I mean, not everybody is above average. We have to have an economy and a society which finds a place for and expects effort from people who are not extraordinary. And I think that's
I agree, but average people
area.
should be oriented to work.
Right. We need to orient people to work and bring back the expectation of work. And that's going to solve that problem to some degree. So, thank you for a wonderful
Yes,
discussion.
it has been a pleasure. You're so cordial.
So are you.
And please share this interview.
I'm glad that we got together.
All right, bye, Professor Wax.
Bye.
JD and MD.